Today we are going to take a look at a very famous author. His name is Lewis Carroll, and I'm sure you've heard of him before and some of his imaginative works. His name, Lewis Carroll, is actually a pen name. His real name is Charles Ludwig Dodson. The reason he had a pen name is because he really wanted to be able to separate his children's work from the other work that he did, because he wasn't just a children's author. He was actually born in 1832 in England, and he was actually a teacher of mathematics at the famous Oxford University. But he also enjoyed other things like writing for children, and he was also a photographer and an inventor. So he enjoyed entertaining children with clever little puzzles and stories. Some of his puzzles were the very first start of what we know today as the game of Scrabble, but he also loved telling stories. His most famous story, I'm sure you've heard, is Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and the sequel, Through the Looking Glass. In today's lesson, we're going to look at the 4 sentence types as kind of a review for you, and we're going to use some of his creative lines. And we are also going to look at a short little poem he wrote called How Doth the Little Crocodile. Before we get to the poem, let's look at a few sentence types. You probably already know that there are 4 types of sentences. The first type is called a declarative sentence. You're just declaring or stating a fact or giving information. You may have learned it as a statement, but a declarative sentence and a statement, they are the same thing. Next is interrogative. You've probably already learned this as a question. So interrogative is just asking a question. It's going to end with a question mark. Imperative is the next one. That's going to be a command. You're going to tell someone to do something. Usually an imperative will have an understood you as the subject. So you won't see the subject in the sentence, but you will be understood. And then finally, exclamatory, that's going to show sudden or strong emotion or feeling, and that's going to end with an exclamation mark. Now let's take a look at the 4 sentence types one by one. These quotes are taken from Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. I can't go back to yesterday because I was a different person then. So this sentence is stating a fact. I can't go back to yesterday because I was a different person then. We're giving information, so this is called a declarative sentence. Next, this one says, who in the world am I? That's the great puzzle. So we're just looking at the first part here. Who in the world am I? Ends with a question mark. So remember, it's just a fancy word for something that ends with a question mark. It's called an interrogative sentence. And don't let that big word confuse you. The way I remember it, I think of investigators going into an interrogation room. And in the interrogation room, they're going to ask the suspect many questions. Where were you? Who were you with? What did you see? What did you do? What happened? And so that's what I remember. Interrogation, interrogative, asks a question. The next one. Begin at the beginning, the king said very gravely, and go on till you come to the end. Then stop. The king here is giving a command. He's telling someone what to do. And remember, most of the time in a command, you is the subject, and that will be understood. If you have diagram sentences in the past, you'll remember that you as the subject goes inside parentheses when it's not found in the actual sentence. So giving a command is going to be an imperative sentence. Don't get confused by this big word. Imperative is a simple way of saying you have to follow a command. I think of it like soldiers obeying orders and the officer in charge pointing at me and saying, it is imperative that you obey these commands. And finally, the last one, curiouser and curiouser, cried Alice. This one is showing sudden or strong emotion or feeling. It's become known as a phrase that people might say when there's something unusual happening around them. And so I put this cute little picture in here. Curiouser and curiouser, cried Alice. So this is an exclamatory sentence, and it's going to end with an exclamation mark. It's going to be really easy to identify this type of sentence because it has the exclamation mark. Okay, let's do a quick little review. We have a declarative sentence, also known as a statement. We're going to give information, typically ends with a period. We're going to have an interrogative question. Remember, we're going to interrogate someone. We're going to ask questions. We're going to end this type of sentence with a question mark. Then we have an imperative sentence. It is imperative that you obey these commands. The subject is most often going to be understood and not actually written into the sentence. And then finally, we have an exclamatory sentence, and that's going to show sudden or strong emotion or feeling. Now that we know a little bit about Lewis Carroll and we have reviewed the 4 sentence types, let's look at a couple of key terms that you're going to need to know when you look at poetry. The first one is stanza, then rhyme scheme, followed by tone and parody. We're going to look at each one of these and how it relates to this poem. How Doth the Little Crocodile by Lewis Carroll. How doth the little crocodile improve his shining tail, and pour the waters of the Nile on every golden scale. How cheerfully he seems to grin, how neatly spreads his claws, and welcomes little fishes in with gently smiling jaws. Hopefully you enjoyed this cute poem. We're just starting with something easy so that we can break it down and look at some of the key terms that you're going to need to know for your high school classes. So first of all, poetry, each part here is called a line. It's just the single row of words. And we're going to look at a few rules, or, well, poets like to break the rules. So the rule is, in poetry, each line is going to start with a capital letter, but feel free to break that rule if you're doing it for some sort of poetic effect. So sometimes you will see that that rule gets broken, but typically in each line of poetry, the first word is going to begin with a capital letter. Now, it doesn't have to be a full sentence, so we'll look at that. Another thing I want you to notice here, that punctuation is optional for poetry. So a lot of times it's going to be a continuation of a thought. It may have a break in the line and move to the next line. It may end with a comma. It may have no punctuation. So you see a variety of things in poetry. We're also going to see that there's an intentional use of incorrect sentence structure. So it's not necessarily going to be a full grammatically correct sentence when we're doing poetry, because we're going to rely heavily on rhythm and rhyme scheme and things like that are going to add emphasis to what the author is trying to get across. So not necessarily a full sentence complete structure when it comes to that. So word selection, like I was just mentioning, is going to be heavily focused on imagery, creating that picture in the mind of the reader, rhyme scheme, and meter. So we'll go through some of those terms if they're unfamiliar to you. So the next thing I want you to look at is how the lines are separated. You see we've got 4 lines, and then we've got a break, and then we've got 4 more lines. So that section of 4 lines is called a stanza. It's going to be a group of lines. They belong together. They relate together. And then we have a break, and then we have a second stanza. So this poem has 2 stanzas. There's a fancy name for a stanza made of 4 lines, and that's called a quatrain. You'll also may have already learned, but 2 lines is called a couplet. 4 lines is what we have here, so that's called a quatrain. So we have 2 stanzas, and those stanzas are each quatrains because they're made up of 4 lines. Now let's look at the rhyme scheme. Rhyme scheme is going to be the pattern of rhyming words at the end of each line in the poem. So the way you figure this out is you're going to assign a letter to each line of the poem based on the sound that it makes. So the first line says, "How doth the little crocodile?" It ends with the word crocodile. So you always assign line 1 the letter A. Anything that rhymes with crocodile in that same stanza is also going to get the letter A. So let's go to the next line here. "Improve his shining tail." Crocodile and tail don't rhyme, so we have to assign that the next letter in the alphabet, B. Let's look at line 3. "And pour the waters of the Nile." So Nile and crocodile rhyme, so we're going to go back to the letter A for line 3. "On every golden scale." Scale and tail rhyme, so we're going to go back to the letter B. So we would say that this stanza has, or this poem has, an A-B rhyme scheme. And we would just look at the second stanza to make sure that that continues. So "How cheerfully he seems to grin, how neatly spreads his claws." They don't match, but let's keep going. "And welcomes little fishes in." So we have grin and in, "with gently smiling jaws." So we've got claws and jaws. So although we assign this CD because it doesn't match exactly the first stanza, the pattern is the same. So we would say that this poem has an A-B rhyme scheme. And sometimes the rhyme scheme might be a little difficult to figure out, and sometimes the poets will break the rhyme scheme. So you do have to look often at more than one stanza to make sure that you're evaluating it correctly. The next word I want you to understand is tone. Anytime you hear the word tone, we're going to be talking about the author's attitude towards a certain subject. And anytime you are asked to describe the word tone, you will always need to find specific words from the work that support the tone that you are assigning to the work. So, for instance, an author's tone could be playful or sorrowful. They could be angry about whatever the topic is they're discussing. But you would want to have specific words that the author uses. You would also look for style and structure, imagery, the picture that is being creative in the reader's mind. All of those things you would add together to support why you chose that word as the tone of this poem. So what do you think the tone of this poem would be? I'm not going to tell you. I want you to be able to look through it and kind of decide for yourself. What is the author, what is the way he's expressing himself in this poem, and what specific words does he use that made you think that was his tone? Okay, I'll help you out a little bit with this one. So we could say that this tone is playful. We could support that. We could say deceptive. We see some reasons for that. We could say that this is a sort of dark humor. So if you chose one of those words for the tone, and again, there's more than one that could be correct, the point is that you support your choice with specific words. So I put in bold here a couple words that would be good supports for some of these answers here for the tone. So little crocodile, are crocodiles really little? Shining tail, that doesn't sound too scary, right? Golden scales, that sounds beautiful. Cheerful, a cheerful crocodile that's grinning, he's smiling, he's harmless. He's neatly spreading his claws. He's not dangerous at all. He's welcoming, and he's gently smiling. He's so sweet and kind. So what is the point of all of these words? Using all of these words, which would you say is the tone of this poem? All right, now the final word I want you to look at is the word parody. A parody is going to be a humorous imitation of another work. And we see parodies all the time on TV. If somebody is kind of making fun of a movie or a quote, maybe a public figure, we see parodies quite often. And it's usually just for entertainment purposes. But To identify a parody, you're going to look again at the word choices, the style and structure, and the imagery. So I want to explain to you why this is important for this particular poem, because you would not understand that this was a parody if you didn't know who Isaac Watts was. Isaac Watts was an English minister. He was also a very famous hymn writer, and he's most famous for the song "When I Survey the Wondrous Cross." He also wrote children's poems, and he used his children's poems to help children memorize biblical truths. And so he's going to use this word choice and style and structure and rhyme scheme and a rhythm to help children put the Word of God and the truths found in it into the hearts of children using poetry. So let's take a look at the original work. It was called Against Idleness, that's laziness, just laying around, and Mischief, getting into trouble, by Isaac Watts. And it's also called How Doth the Little Busy Bee. Sound familiar? Let's take a look at his original poem. How doth the little busy bee improve each shining hour, and gather honey all the day from every opening flower. How skillfully she builds her cell, how neat she spreads the wax, and labors hard to store it well with the sweet food she makes. In works of labor or of skill, I would be busy too, for Satan finds some mischief still for idle hands to do. In books or work or healthful play, let my years be past, that I may give for every day some good account at last. So does that sound familiar? The original work has a busy bee working all the day long, gathering honey from all the flowers, moving from one to the next, not stopping, not slowing down, not getting into trouble. So she's working skillfully, she's being neat, she's working hard. We see all these words that are contributing to the tone of this poem. She's storing up for the future. Her food is sweet. And he's looking at the work that this bee is doing and say, I should be busy too, because when I have too much time to myself, I might get into a little bit of trouble. Satan's going to find some mischief for idle hands to do. And do you ever see that maybe if you have too much time on your hands, maybe you get on your phone, or maybe you start scrolling through screens, and maybe you might put something before your eyes that wouldn't be pleasing to the Lord. Maybe you might, I know that sometimes we might get annoyed with each other because we're bored and we don't have anything meaningful that we're doing at that moment. So sometimes some bickering happens when there's not enough work to do, when people don't know what to do with themselves. And so he's encouraging children to read books, to work hard, to play in a healthy way that's good for your body, to make yourself strong. And he wants his early years to be full of these things because he wants to be able to give a good account for the things he has done. And that includes how he spends his time. So the same goes for you and me. We're going to give an account for every word that we say, everything that we do, and we want to say things and do things that are pleasing to the Lord. And so this, I can't say for certain, but I would imagine that this would have been a poem that Lewis Carroll had memorized, maybe as a child, or maybe he was required as a teacher to teach this poem. But for whatever reason, he certainly was familiar with this poem. And he made a parody of it with his famous poem, How Doth the Little Crocodile, which may be more popular these days than Against Idleness and Mischief by Isaac Watts. But listen to a little bit of his famous hymn, When I Survey the Wondrous Cross, and see if it sounds familiar to you as we do our review. So our final review, we've got a stanza, which is a group of lines in poetry that belong together. How Doth the Little Crocodile had 2 stanzas. They were made of 4 lines each, so that was called a quatrain. Then we have the rhyme scheme. That's the pattern of assigning letters to the rhyming sound at the end of each line to see if there's a pattern that gets created. We also have tone, which is the author's attitude towards a certain subject or topic, and you're going to use specific words from the work to identify and support your reasoning behind the word that you chose for the tone of the work. And that could go for a book or other things outside of poetry as well. So it'll be important for all of literature. And then parody is going to be a humorous imitation of someone else's work. So understanding these terms are really going to help you when you need to do any sort of poetry analysis or answer short answer questions or longer questions about a particular work. So understanding these words will really help you with your analysis.